I want to introduce Mark Maloy. Mark is a great friend of the American Battlefield Trust. He's an author, he's a National Park Service historian. He also is a historian for emerging Revolutionary War. He's written a lot for battlefields.org. You might have seen him over at battlefields.org. But today we're going to focus on Victory or Death, his book on the battles of Trenton and Princeton, 1776 and 1777 battle, respectively. The American Battlefield Trust has done a lot of work up at Princeton, helping to preserve George Washington's charge there in January of 1777. So I'm sure Mark's going to talk all about that, talk about one of the most famous actions at the Battle of Trenton. And if you want to head over to Emerging Revolutionary War, check out their website. Mark is actually leading a tour this November of what we call the 10 Crucial Days, which will take place in 1776 to 77 and cover these battles of Trenton, Second Trenton, Princeton, and beyond. So with that, I'm going to turn everything over to Mark, and I'm going to shut my camera off and shut my mouth up. So Mark, please feel free to take over, and thank you for joining us today at battlefields.org.
All right. Thank you, Chris, for the invitation. Thank you, everybody, for taking time out of your day to listen to me talk today about my book, Victory or Death, The Battles of Trenton and Princeton. Like Chris mentioned, I write for Emerging Revolutionary War. One of the things that we're really keen on is going to the site where history actually happened. And Trenton and Princeton are, in my opinion, some of the most important battles in American history. Going up there today, as Chris mentioned, I work for the National Park Service, but there is no national park that interprets Trenton and Princeton. But as he mentioned, this is referred to as the 10 Crucial Days. And I'm going to give you a little presentation, kind of go over kind of some of the historic context of why these were so crucial, what happened, and also what you can see there today. And yeah, if you're interested in learning more about this, you can check out my book, which includes a lot of this information, also includes a driving tour to take you to all the different places where the history happened. Sometimes at those places, there is nothing to mark or tell you the importance of that location. But if you have the book, you'll be able to actually know what happened there. And if you want to actually come up with us, in November, we're going to be doing a bus tour of Trenton and Princeton. You can find all that information on the Emerging Revolutionary War website. But I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I got a little presentation for you. Let's see. So hopefully you all can see my presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to talk to you for about 45 minutes, and then if we have questions, I'll be happy to answer that afterwards. So the story of Trenton and Princeton really starts on July 4th, 1776. Now, this is probably one of the most famous images of that moment, when the colonies of the United, declared their independence and became the United States of America. Now, this painting you see here of all the members of Congress there together drafting this document is kind of how we've remembered this moment, but that's not actually how it played out. You had all these colonies, with different interests and viewpoints trying to come together, and the idea of independence was kind of a slow move towards that. There was a lot of people who didn't want to go to all the way to independence. They wanted to try and resolve things, but stay within the British Empire. But then, of course, the war began, and we drifted closer and closer to independence. Now, when they actually do vote for independence in July of 1776, they did this after a couple victories for the Patriot cause. In March of 1776, General George Washington and the Continental Army up around Boston drive the British out of Boston. That June, down in South Carolina, Charleston, South Carolina, Patriots drive the British Navy away from their coast. And it was with these victories that they have the confidence to go ahead and declare independence. Well, Great Britain isn't about to let her rebellious colonies go without a fight. And in that summer, the British Parliament and King George III are going to send the largest expeditionary force Great Britain has ever sent anywhere in the world up to that point to the new United States. And their target is the city of New York. In this expeditionary force are 32,000 British soldiers and sailors. Among them are about 8,000 hired Hessian mercenaries. That's what they're often called. Better term for them probably is auxiliaries. These were German soldiers who were hired by the crown to be sent over here. And so these men were actually loyal to their princes back in Germany. And they were some of the most professional soldiers in all of Europe. So they're going to be sent over here as well. And they had a renowned, they're renowned for their discipline. They're also known for their ferocity in combat. And they would be some of the most feared soldiers in this expedition coming to the United States. George Washington has the unenviable task to try and defend the city of New York. Now, Congress wants there to be a fight for this city. So Washington's going to, have to try and defend a bunch of these islands up there around New York. Well, the British have one of the most powerful navies in the world at that time. So trying to defend a bunch of islands with his army is going to be difficult. Now, Washington does have a huge army. He has almost 24,000 soldiers in his army. And these are continental soldiers, paid soldiers, but then also militia who have just volunteered to fight in these battles. And Washington's going to try and make a stand here at New York, and it's going to turn out to be an utter disaster. Washington's men are just defeated terribly at the Battle of Long Island, which happened right around where Brooklyn is today. Washington's army is beaten back. Almost half of his army is destroyed there, but Washington's going to actually do a nighttime evacuation across the East River. And he's going to be able to save his 9,000 men that were there. Then he's going to try and make a stand on Manhattan. The British, hit him at Kips Bay. At Kips Bay, some of Washington's men just dropped their guns without firing a shot and run. And then they're going to fall back up to Harlem. They're able to fight all right there, but eventually they're pushed back to White Plains. They're going to lose that. Then they're going to lose Fort Washington and Fort Lee. And it's just disaster after disaster after disaster all throughout August, September, and October of 1776. Washington's men are going to be pushed back across the state of New Jersey. And you can see Washington's men retreat across the state of New Jersey. They cross the Delaware River that you see highlighted there that divides Pennsylvania from New Jersey. And the British, as you can see, their goal hopefully was to get, you see circled down there in the bottom corner, Philadelphia, which was the capital of the United States at that time. Washington's men along the way, all right, so they're going to be losing thousands of men to battle casualties, killed, wounded. They're going to be losing guys to disease. And then they're going to use, most of the men are probably deserting, people who think that this is a lost cause, and just walking off the field. The British chase them across New Jersey. Washington's force depletes from, like I said, almost 24,000 men. At one point, Washington says he can only count 3,000 men in his column, which shows you just the massive amount of losses that they experienced. They're able to get across the Delaware River in December 1776, and they are able to secure all the boats on the river. And there are no bridges going over the Delaware. So the British are going to make it up to Trenton, which you can see circled there right at the fall line of the Delaware River. And General William Howe, who's commanding the British, decides that he's going to call it a campaign for that time, and that they're going to wait either for the ice on the river to get so frozen that his men would be able to march across and go into Philadelphia, but he's going to or just wait until the spring campaigning season. So he's going to pull his guys back to New York. We can see all these little red squares mark different places where he's going to leave different outposts of men. So he's going to leave just a few thousand men here and there across the state of New Jersey, basically to try and pacify the countryside It does actually quite the opposite, because many of the Hessians and British soldiers are going to be looting and doing all sorts of terrible things to the countryside that riles up the population. And some of the New Jersey militia is going to rise up to perform raids on all these different outposts. But Washington's in a tough situation. So he's sitting here on the Pennsylvania side of the river, looking at his army, which is literally dissolving in front of his eyes. There's a great story of Charles Wilson Peale, who's probably most famous for doing some paintings of George Washington. He was a painter, and he commands some Pennsylvania troops. And in fact, he sees this one Continental soldier march past him, come out of the line. He said his clothes were all in threads. His face was covered with a beard that he couldn't, and his face was also filled with sores that he couldn't even clean his beard. And he was unrecognizable. And while he was talking to him, he realized only after he started talking to him that he was actually talking to his own brother, who was a soldier in the Maryland line. The privation of these troops is just as bad as you've heard in all the stories. No shoes, barefoot. Officers said that you could actually follow the path of Washington's army from the blood in the snow. That just shows you, what was motivating these guys to hang on is just, beyond comprehension. And Washington has a major problem because Philadelphia, the Congress evacuates. They leave it. They say, they basically leave George Washington dictator-like powers. They say, if you want to raise an army, raise a new army, which, from a small R Republican standpoint, it goes against the very ideals of the revolution. But, and also his army, the few thousand guys he has left, almost all of their enlistments are going to expire on January 1st, 1777. So it's December 76. He's got a few more weeks before his army is going to literally cease to exist. Now, this is a map that you'll actually find in the book when he's driving towards. Today, when you go to the places where this happened, there are still places that you can see that exist during this terrible time. So during the first couple weeks in December, for instance, you'll see the house that Washington actually stayed at. This was his headquarters building in Morrisville, Pennsylvania. It was in this building where Washington is writing back to his home, back to his brother. He actually writes, I think the game is pretty near up, and starts preparing for an evacuation of his wife down in Mount Vernon. When the commander-in-chief is talking about the cause is almost lost, it really shows you how close to defeat they were. And you can see on this map also different numbers at places where Washington is eventually going to cross the Delaware River. But before he did that, there's a solemn place, especially, this week being, just being Memorial Day. When you go up on the banks of the Delaware, there's actually a place preserved that holds the graves of some of Washington's men who died of disease in December of 1776. And one of the things that's just really touching and moving when I'm at this location is to think about those guys who died in December of 1776. For all they knew, the last thing they knew was that their cause was lost and that the war was over. And yet they stuck it out far from their homes. In Washington's army were guys from Virginia all the way up to New Hampshire. So you had everywhere in between represented here. And many of these men are going to, like I said, die not knowing that one day they would be, eventually celebrated as heroes of founding the country. So Washington has to come up with a plan. What's he going to do? Washington actually, and that's where I get the title from the book. He's actually going to devise this plan. The password for this is going to be victory or death, which, it's absolutely true that, he had to find some sort of military victory. Otherwise, the whole cause was doomed. So Washington's going to devise this plan. He looks at Trenton, New Jersey, and in Trenton were stationed 1,500 Hessians, some of those German auxiliaries under the command of Colonel Johann Rahl. They were isolated here. Washington felt that, if he could cross the Delaware River and attack them, he would be able to win this victory and then be able to recross the Delaware back into Pennsylvania. So he devised actually kind of a complicated plan where he divides his force into 3 different places, and he's going to cross the Delaware River at 3 different locations, and he's going to attack these Hessians at Trenton. He sets the date for the night of Christmas, 1776. Now, that same evening, a terrible nor'easter comes through. We're talking snowing, sleeting, raining, ice, hail. One soldier said it blew a perfect hurricane. So this terrible weather comes on. The ice starts building up on the Delaware River, so bad so that the 2 divisions other than Washington's main division, 2 of the divisions are unable to cross that night. So they try crossing, they can't get across the river, so they stay on the other side. Washington's going to be the only one crossing the Delaware. So Washington and his soldiers, about 2,400 guys, are going to cross the Delaware River, as you can see up there at McConkey's Ferry. Now comes this. You can see it behind me, probably the most famous image of this whole campaign, Washington crossing the Delaware. Did it look like this painting? No. There are numerous inaccuracies in this painting. Of course, you don't see that terrible weather in this image. The sun is out, and you can see they're crossing the Delaware. If you actually go to the site where Washington crossed the Delaware, is not this broad. This painting was done by Emanuel Leutze about 80 years after the fact. And that river actually probably looks more like the Rhine, where he was painting over in Germany. You'll see this small boat, the rowboat that they're all in. Now, they were likely using large Durham boats that actually could hold much more people in it. Everybody likes to comment, would Washington have been standing in a little rowboat? Probably not, but if he crossed over one of the Durham boats, he likely would have been standing in one of those because they didn't have seats. Now, despite, and the American flag you see there, of course, that wasn't adopted until a year later. The ice you see forming on the river, the actual ice on the Delaware is usually a little bit flatter, not like small icebergs like that. So despite all these inaccuracies, the painting does a great job of showing the desperation of the moment. Here was Washington, his back literally against the wall, going up against all odds. The wind in their faces. You'll see in the boat there near the front an African-American. We do know there are African-Americans that did participate in the crossing, and the artist wanted to show, all the different people that were involved in the American cause. The man holding the flag there was a young Lieutenant James Monroe, who left his studies at William and Mary in Virginia and joined up. And now, was he in the same boat as Washington? Probably not, but he was part of this crossing. There's actually quite a few famous Americans that were part of this crossing, including Alexander Hamilton, who was commanding some artillery. So this painting really does get across the desperation of the moment. Washington, at one point, the crossing goes so slow. Washington wanted to cross the Delaware and attack them before the sun even rose. Well, they were going so slow across the river that he realized that they weren't going to be able to go until it was daylight, and had a moment there of thinking, should he call the whole operation off and send everybody back over? But Washington writes to Congress afterwards. He said, I fixed my mind on it. I was, resolved to take Trenton at all costs. So he was putting all the chips on the table at this moment. Now, the only problem with this painting is most people know this painting. They don't know what happened once Washington got across the river. Well, his men had a 9-mile march in that blizzard to do. So this shows you the path that Washington's men are going to do. They get across the river about 4 in the morning, and they start marching down towards Trenton. You can see there at Birmingham, they're going to break off into 2 columns, and they're actually going to hit the Hessians in the morning, almost exactly at the same time at 8 in the morning. Now, if you look today, if you go there, like I said, this is a little image there of where the crossing happened. There's a marker there, and there's 2 state parks, one Pennsylvania and one New Jersey, that interprets Washington's crossing. Over in New Jersey, they even have part of a lane that some of the Continentals march through, which is kind of neat to see. But they continue marching down, and they charge into the town right about 8 a.m. Like I said, Now, the common story is that the Hessians were all drunk. They had been celebrating Christmas. They were, easy prey for the Americans. Well, that in fact is a myth. The Hessians were actually not drinking that evening. In fact, the opposite. They were responding to alarms from the New Jersey militia almost constantly. And there were constant talk of Washington's army attempting to attack them, but usually they were small, militia skirmishes here and there. And in fact, that very evening, just before Washington's guys came, some of Washington's men had crossed earlier that night and attacked an outpost. And, for all the talk that there was going to be an attack on them, they thought this little skirmish they did that night before was the big attack. And the weather actually worked to Washington's advantage. The snow was so bad that the Hessian outposts went into their, they weren't doing their usual patrols. So the Hessians, were they drunk? No, but were they surprised? Absolutely. They were taken by surprise. Washington's men come charging into the city. You're going to be, as soon as they take the high ground, right where King and Queen Street interact, they're going to place 9 artillery pieces up there and start firing down into the town. Colonel Henry Knox talks about how, the fright and hurry was not unlike that which would be when the last trump shall sound. And Americans are running into houses and firing from windows. You're going to have street fighting. Now, a lot of their muskets and stuff weren't working because of the weather. So there's going to be a lot of hand-to-hand combat, bayonets, musket clubs, and the like. You can see Sullivan's division comes down along the river road. They're going to drive Rawls' men out of the town, and then Rawls going to make a couple attempts, different attacks to try and counterattack. Both of them are repulsed. And in one case, they make it all the way back to King Street, recapture their artillery before they're driven out by the Americans. After sustaining about 22 men killed, 80 wounded, the Hessians are going to end up surrendering after about 45 minutes to an hour of combat in Trenton. On the opposite side, the Americans lost nobody killed. There were about 4 or 5 men wounded, and probably a couple men who froze to death on the march to Trenton. So this was an amazing victory for Washington, and one that he had to have. Washington's going to capture about 900 Hessians as prisoner. And among the wounded was Colonel Rawle, who takes 2 musket balls to his side. He falls from his horse, and he's going to pass away the next day. Now, today, when you go to Trenton, there is no, like I said, national park or anything, but if you go, it's a modern city today, but the street grid generally follows the same street grid that was there back in 1776. There's a large fitting monument to George Washington right where the artillery was lined up. Among those artillery pieces was young Alexander Hamilton's artillery company, and he was there firing down on the Hessians. And you get a great vantage point from that location of the city of Trenton. Today, down near where Sullivan's guys came through, is a restored old barracks in the city of Trenton, and that's owned by the city of Trenton. They have a museum and interpret not just this battle, but also colonial soldiers in America at that time. Throughout the city, you'll find plaques and markers that denote locations, for instance, where Rawls' headquarters were, and where some of the fiercest fighting actually happened there. And in other places, you won't find any markers. So this shows you a view from where the Hessian artillery was, looking up at that Trenton battle monument. There's no marker here, but like I said, some of the worst fighting happened here. And at one point in the fighting, Henry Knox saw that the Hessians had fought their way back to these artillery pieces and were getting ready to fire them, and he ordered some men nearby to go capture that. Well, a young William Washington, one of George Washington's distant cousins, and a young Lieutenant James Monroe are going to charge that piece, and both are wounded at that location. In fact, a musket ball hits James Monroe in the shoulder, severs an artery, nearly kills him. But his artery's clamped and he's taken back and survives. Monroe, of course, will go on to become the 5th president of the United States. But today, this quiet, street there in Trenton, no markers or anything like that, but that's where that happened. And how many people, drive over this, walk over this ground, not realizing, one of the most important battles in American military history happened right on those streets. And here's a glorified a painting that was done by John Trumbull of the surrender of the Hessians that morning. You can see the wounded Rawl there going to meet with George Washington. If you look by Rawl's hand in the background there, you'll see James Monroe wounded lying on the ground. But this was the victory Washington needed. He gets his men, transports all the prisoners back across the river. He gets on the Pennsylvania side of the river. So these guys are exhausted. They just, crossed the Delaware, marched 9 miles, fought a battle, marched 9 miles, crossed the river, and they were exhausted. And Washington wanted to see, if he could press his advantage after this. Well, the British are furious at this. Up in New York City, Cornwallis, General Charles Cornwallis, was actually getting ready to go back to England on leave, and he was actually going to report to the king about their huge victory, about how they had defeated the Americans that summer, and that Philadelphia was going to fall next. Well, all of a sudden, things had changed. So what Cornwallis was going to do is gather up every British redcoat he could in New York and start marching down to try and crush Washington. Washington sees an advantage. So what he's going to do is he's going to cross back over into New Jersey and set up camp down there in Trenton. And this shows you a map of the British approach towards Trenton. So you can see here in Trenton, there's a creek that runs there, the Assunpink Creek. Washington is going to basically put all of his men, and now, Washington actually, after the victory at Trenton, he gathers his men there at Trenton, and their enlistments are about to expire. And Washington gathers them up, and he says, and he actually does a speech in front of them, which Washington rarely did. And he said, your wives, your homes, everything you hold dear is in the balance. And he says, if you will commit to just stay on for one more month, you will render that service to the cause of liberty in your country, which you can probably not do under any other circumstance. And this impassioned plea from their commander-in-chief works. Along with also, he was able to secure some more bounty money for them. And the Americans stepped forward, and a large portion of Washington's army, those veterans that he needed, are going to stay on to fight in these next couple battles that are coming up. So Washington's army now is swelled with reinforcements too from Philadelphia. He's going to have about 6,000 men, and he positions them there, you see, on the south side of the Assunpink Creek. And Cornwallis's guys are coming down. It's now January 2nd, 1777. They're marching down the road towards Trenton. Washington sets up these kind of little ambushes all the way along the way throughout the day to try and slow down Cornwallis's army. And you have Edward Hand, who's going to be leading a lot of this effort. And throughout the day, January 2nd, the British are fighting. They have to stop, deploy into line, fight across a creek, go back into column, get across the river or get across the creek, keep going down to the next creek. So each creek was almost like a little delaying action until it was about 4 or 5 o'clock at night. And the last Americans made it across the Assunpink Creek. The British march into Trenton. And as you can see down there at the bottom, there are 3 numbers, 1, 2, 3. They're going to do 3 quick charges to try and get across a little bridge there. There's Assunpink Creek. And the Americans just, decimate the British as they try to get across this creek with artillery and musket fire. It's getting dark too. And Cornwallis says, we'll wait for the morning. We'll bag the old fox tomorrow morning. And now Washington is in a real difficult situation. What's he going to do? Okay, he can try and stand the next morning against, this British force that is about the same size as his own, except much more disciplined. If he makes a stand there and he loses, Washington doesn't have much place to retreat. He could be pinned against the Delaware River. Washington could try and fall back, but then it would look like the Battle of Trenton was just a fluke, and he would eventually lose. And Washington can come up with this, third option. It's one of the most remarkable in the whole war. And let me just show you this too. When you go to the sites there today, so along the way, you can actually drive down to each of these creeks. You'll find these small markers that actually tell you the importance of each of these different locations. And you can go see the Douglas House, which has been moved a couple times, but it's there in a city park there in Trenton. And this is the house where Washington's going to make, one of the most bold decisions of the whole war. He's going to make the decision that instead of fighting there, instead of retreating, he's going to pull back and he's going to march around. He's going to flank the entire British army, and he's going to strike at their rear guard up in Princeton. So this shows you a map of exactly what he does. So you can see Washington disengages. This is in the middle of the night, January 2nd, 1777, marches up around the British flank and is going to strike them at the back. Now, he leaves a few guys in town to build up campfires to make it appear that he's staying there to fight. And that's what Cornwallis and most of the British believes happening. And it's not until the next morning that they find out that Washington had marched 12 miles around him and had struck their rear guard at Princeton. Now today you can see these markers. You'll see these stone obelisks that kind of mark the location of all the different places where Washington's troops marched around, which is kind of cool to be able to follow. Now the next morning, what happens is Washington's hoping for the exact same thing as at Trenton. He's hoping he's going to strike these guys, surprise them early in the morning. Well, what he didn't know was that the British troops that were stationed there under Colonel Maloy are actually heading down. They had woken up early and they were marching down to join up with Cornwallis for the big fight they were expecting down at Trenton. What happens is both sides recognize what's happening and they both kind of move into the middle. And you can see there in the middle between the Thomas Clark House and the William Clark House, they're going to engage in what becomes the Battle of Princeton. Now, what happens is Washington sends out first a brigade of men under his friend, Colonel or General Hugh Mercer, who's a Virginian, who's was one of Washington's friends, and his men, about 300 guys, are going to go up against the 17th Regiment of Foot, which is most of the guys who are going to be engaged here at Princeton. And the 17th Regiment of Foot comes up to them, and there's some savage fighting that happens there in the orchard at William Clark's farm. Mercer's guys are going to be, they have rifles, most of them. So they're able to kill a few of the 17th, but then they get overrun by the 17th's bayonets. Mercer himself is wounded and tries to put up a fight, but is bayoneted 7 times. There are other men who are either killed or, bayoneted numerous times on the field. One was a Lieutenant Bartholomew Yates, gets bayoneted 13 times there in that orchard. So it's brutal fighting, but Mercer's men are going to break and run. And as they're running back, they run into a bunch of the remnants of, or those remnants run into some Philadelphia militia, Pennsylvania militia. They're called associators. And they run into each other. And the associators, they're pretty green troops. This is their first battle they're really seeing. And so they start panicking too. And then all of a sudden you gotta get this ripple effect where panic starts spreading through the American lines and guys start falling back. There are 2 pieces of artillery, American artillery, that fire at the British and kind of hold them at bay for a couple minutes. But it was in this critical moment that it looked like, the British might win the Battle of Princeton. And again, this would have made, the other actions all for naught. Well, at this critical moment, through the smoke, who rides in? George Washington, riding through the smoke, riding up to the Americans, exclaiming, "Parade with us, my brave fellows. There's but a handful of the enemy, and we will have them directly." One of his aides, Colonel John Fitzgerald, who's from the town I'm in, Alexandria, Virginia, he records one of the most amazing sights of the war. He said Washington rode up in between the British and the American lines, was 30 yards from the British when both sides leveled their muskets and everybody fired at once. And Colonel Fitzgerald covered his eyes with his hat. He was afraid to see Washington cut down in front of him. And when he lifted his hat and he looked on, the smoke cleared and there was Washington riding up and down unscathed. It's one of the most remarkable moments of the whole war. There was a Pennsylvania soldier who said, "When I saw him brave all the dangers of the field, his important life hanging as it were with a single hair, with 1,000 deaths flying around him, believe me, I thought not of myself." Washington rallies these guys, they reform, reinforcements come up, and then Washington leads what Chris originally called, Washington's charge. Washington orders them to fight. He orders them to fire on the British, then to level their bayonets and charge after the British. The 17th Regiment of Foot putting up a good fight, but realize they are totally outnumbered. They're going to fall back, and the Americans drive them off the field. Washington spurring his horse after the British, saying, "It's a fine day for a fox hunt, my boys," which was kind of Washington getting back at the British, often blowing fox hunt horns, pretending that the Americans were easily dispersed. But here the tables are turned. This was Washington's first battlefield victory over British redcoats in the open field of battle. Washington drives them from the field. Meanwhile, back at Trenton, Cornwallis hears the firing. His men come rushing up, but by the time they get up here, it's too late. The Americans had driven the 17th driven the 17th Regiment of Foot off the field. They capture some British soldiers up at Nassau Hall, which is today in Princeton University. Then it was the College of New Jersey. And then they don't wait around. They immediately start heading up towards the hills of Morristown, where he's going to go into winter quarters. But when you go to the field today, now the Princeton Battlefield State Park, a good portion is preserved by the state of New Jersey. But like Chris mentioned, the American Battlefield Trust did a great job of preserving a large section that was likely to be developed by a neighboring institution. But here you can see on the State Battlefield Park preserves the Thomas Clark House, which is original, witness to the battle. It's been added on to, but it was in this house that Hugh Mercer was brought back after the fighting. And after 12 days, or after a few days, on January 12th, he's going to pass away in this house. So that's preserved today. And you can, like I said, when you go up there, you can see the field where Washington, actually led this charge up against the British. Which again, it's amazing that the national significance of this right there in Princeton. And here again is a kind of a romanticized image by John Trumbull. Here you see Washington at I would argue his finest moment, riding up there, leading the charge. This formed a bond between Washington and his men that would last the duration of the war and later on in his life. And you can see down at the bottom there, you can see Hugh Mercer being, fighting off a bayonet wound. In the distance, you can see the College of New Jersey. Today, they do battle reenactments of the battle of Trenton and Princeton on the actual field. Here you can see, you actually see me there in the bottom right-hand corner, being able to participate in some of these events, to recreate the events on the actual ground where it happened. And it's something that, it really brought to life for me during the 225th anniversary of the battles of Trenton and Princeton. They did a massive reenactment of these battles on the actual ground, and it was something to really connect to the site. But yeah, so the 10 crucial days, these were the days that saved the whole war. It's likely that, had Washington alone been a casualty at any point during this, it would change the course of American history. And also, like I said, if his whole army dissolved there on the banks of the Delaware, but he turned it around. There was a young author who traveled with Washington soldiers, Thomas Paine, who wrote on the retreat across New Jersey, "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country, but he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered, but we have the satisfaction, the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph." And I think those are words, and this is a story that can still resonate with people to this very day. Anytime you feel you have your back against the wall, I mean, this is a true David and Goliath matchup, and Washington was able to pull this victory from the jaws of death. And it's a pretty amazing story. Historians have routinely cited this as being the most important military campaign of the war. You had a British historian, which I think really summed it up best. He said, perhaps in the history of the world, there have not been so few men in such a short amount of time who had more lasting impacts on the history of the world. And that's something that I for sure definitely believe. And it's something that, it makes me, I'm really proud to be able to talk about this story, to tell the stories of how, the tables turned at Trenton and Princeton. and the importance of place, being able to go to those sites to see where the sacrifice and where these moments happened, to be able to go up there near the anniversaries and things like that, I think is really important. So it's just a great story. It's really important to the history of our country. Like I said, at this point, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. And I'd be happy to answer any of your questions. And I hope you continue to engage with us through our Facebook, Emerging Revolutionary War. We also have a Twitter page, and then also our blog, emergingrevolutionarywar.org.
All right, thanks, Mark. We really appreciate you being out today and for this great presentation. A couple questions here. So let's start off. We had one about the John Trumbull painting of Declaration of Independence. I answered that already for some folks, but they were asking what the flags were in the background, and that was a little bit of artist discretion there. And those were flags that were supposedly British flags that were captured on the battlefield and displayed, and that's what he thought that the halls of Congress would actually have up there. Mark, question for you. Of course, we have to go into movies because that's how everyone learns their history. It's a great gateway to get folks into history. So how accurate is the movie The Crossing with Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain? Jeff Daniels as George Washington.
So I am a fan of the movie. I do watch it every Christmas time, usually with a glass of Madeira there, so I can just like Jeff Daniels does. There's a lot of inaccuracies that some of them, exactly what I just talked about. They show the fighting happening. My big complaint is how they show the fighting. The fighting is shown. The weather's not bad. They show them as all going in and not firing at all, except for the one guy who loads his musket and shoots brawl, which is not how it happened at all. I like Jeff Daniels' portrayal in showing Washington as a younger man who, is capable of being extremely angry and upset, and shows that temper that Washington was famous to have. What I don't like is that he doesn't really get Washington also, his whole thing was about controlling that. I think David Morse's portrayal of Washington and John Adams really hits the nail on the head. He gets Washington as this, being very reserved, not talking much. Of course, his teeth bothering him and everything else like that. Jeff Daniels does an all right job. I think he gets some of that across. And The Crossing is a good movie that kind of shows that basic arc, but the only thing it's missing is at the end, it doesn't show the second battle of Trenton or the battle of Princeton. And I think you probably heard from my presentation, I think that charge at Princeton is really a defining moment, and it would have been great to see that captured sometime on the silver screen. But Crossing, numerous inaccuracies like most movies, still entertaining, and it's a great gateway to want to learn more about those battles.
All right. So a question about the Hessian POWs from Trenton. Where were they sent to after they were captured?
Yeah. So like I said, they take them across the river. They're the officers dine with Washington afterwards, which, was a common 18th century thing. People think is pretty crazy today, but he dines with them. And then he's going to send them down to Philadelphia. Where they're actually paraded through the streets of Philadelphia. People had heard all these stories of the Hessians of being, monsters that, killed babies and stuff like that, like just awful things. So people were kind of excited to see what these people looked like. They see the Hessians that are paraded through the streets, and then they're sent to prisoner of war camps. Some of them there in Pennsylvania, some of the officers sent down to Virginia. They're going to be kept in prisoner of war camps, and many of them are actually going to end up deserting and staying here in the United States. There is a huge German immigrant population here in the United States. In fact, I talk about in the book when they're yelling at the Hessians to surrender, one of the American regiments was filled with Pennsylvania Dutchmen who are going to be yelling at them in German to throw down their weapons and surrender. So seeing some fellow Germans here in America, some of them are going to end up staying here. A lot of people, if you dig through your personal history, you might find you actually have an ancestor who was once a Hessian.
Yeah, they build some of their own barracks, like Carlisle Barracks. There's the Hessian Barracks there. That you go down to Frederick, Maryland. There's a great building down there built by the Hessians, and they were controversial in their time being here. In the United States, that shows up in the Declaration of Independence. They're actually using mercenaries against us, and then they also have in Great Britain, they thought that it was a little bit shady to use these auxiliaries or mercenaries, depending on whose terminology you use, to come over here. And they use about 29,000 of these men, and the crown's paying about just a little more than 17 pounds per year per man for each one of them. So they're an interesting set of soldiers to read about. So, Mark, question about more on Hessians. Did Washington's men steal any of their footwear?
That's a good question. In Trenton, in addition to capturing all the men, they are going to capture, clothes, blankets, tents, flags. There's actually a band there too in Trenton and stuff too. So they are going to capture that. As far as I would imagine if I was barefoot, I would take a pair of shoes. Now, Rawl does meet with Washington afterwards, and Rawl specifically asks Washington to not steal from his soldiers and to treat them with dignity, which is interesting because up in New York during the battles there, the Hessians were pretty ruthless to surrendering American troops. There's stories of the Hessians actually bayoneting American riflemen and then leaving them with their bayoneted stuck to trees and things like that, like awful, awful stories. And so it's actually interesting that Washington, he could have been quite ruthless and either massacred them or, really treated them poorly. But Washington, realizing the PR of the whole thing is going to order his men to treat them well. Whether they took their shoes, I don't know. I haven't read anything specifically about that, but I can only imagine if my feet were bleeding in the snow that I would try and get them. But I don't know if they were forbidden by the American officers from treating the prisoners harshly. So.
Yeah, and that goes back to the whole mercenary versus auxiliary. A lot of these auxiliaries, the money's going to the Prince of Hesse-Kassel or Brandenburg or wherever they're coming from, the six principalities. When they come here, the soldiers, they're here to make their own fortunes. So they're going to steal, plunder anything they can. And then a lot of them hang out, like you said, afterwards and defect to stay here. So two more quick questions for you, Mark, before we let you go. First off, the reenactment photo showed the colonial uniforms with blue coats and red borders. Did they actually wear uniforms? And if so, were these accurate representations?
Yeah. So, like I said, the Americans at this point in the war, it was kind of a hodgepodge of stuff. If guys were able to have coats, the common American coats, were either blue, faced red, or sometimes brown, faced red. Each different state or region had kind of different uniform coats. A lot of the guys also just had hunting shirts, which was pretty common for the soldiers. And then others, like I said, they had blankets and things like that over them. So it just depended different soldiers where they were from and what they had at the time. But you would have seen kind of like in that image, kind of a hodgepodge of different uniforms would have been the case.
Yeah, and that's a great photograph. And for those of you who are members of the American Battlefield Trust, we actually just did a live action Revolutionary War video and photo shoot down in North Carolina, which we'll be using in a lot of our videos that you see online. If you head over to our YouTube channel, you can learn more about Washington Crossing. You can see, if you actually go to Washington Crossing, which is a really cool site in eastern Pennsylvania, you can actually see a replica of the Emanuel Leutze painting that's behind Mark. It's massive. It's taken right from the Met in New York. And so you can see that there. You can see some of the monuments that Mark showed you. And you can see some of the other great sites. They also have Durham boats, not full-scale Durham boats, but they have Durham boats that they take across the river every Christmas. So it's a really cool site to go and visit. Mark, finally, before we let you go, are there still seats available on your bus tour? So at least somebody wants to go on your bus tour. You sold somebody.
Yes, yeah. That would be November 12th through 14th. If you want to find out more about that, you can go to emergingrevolutionarywar.org. There's a little section there about the bus tour. And yeah, to be able to, like I said, be able to hear some of these stories more in depth, and to be in the actual spot where these events happened is something unlike anything else. You can't really get it through the virtual stuff. To actually be on the site is really the best way to learn the history. So yes, yeah, there is space, and yeah, you can just go to emergingrevolutionarywar.org.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, Mark. Getting out on the battlefield is the best way to do it. We'll be getting back out into the battlefield this summer. If you're a $100 or above member of the American Battlefield Trust, expect an email soon to tell you about some of those opportunities. We will have our fall color bearer event down in Richmond next year. Hopefully, third time will be a charm, and we'll be in Chantilly and actually see Mark in person. We've been pushing this talk back for a few years now due to COVID, but we'll be out there for our annual conference in person in May of 2022. So, Mark, I want to thank you. I want to encourage everybody to head over to battlefields.org. Check out all the great resources we have about the 10 crucial days, about Princeton, Washington's Crossing. Head over to our YouTube channel. You can learn more about the actions there at Washington Crossing, and we had some Facebook Live at Princeton many years ago, showing some of the land that we helped to preserve at Princeton. And also head over to Emerging Revolutionary War, and you can check out all the great sites there and all the great topics that they have, and check out Mark's bus tour that's coming up here in November of 2021.